you.
I'm don't have my gavel, so I'll just have to bang an imaginary gavel. But we are going to commence with our Budget Conference Committee. With that, we have Mr. Brown and Mr. Brown from LAO. First item is cap and trade.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ross Brown with the LAO. Issue 1 on your agenda on page 3 is the cap and trade expenditure package for 16-17. The agenda includes a table, and the table actually spans 2 pages, so pages 3 and 4, and summarizes the different expenditure packages for 16-17, including the governor's proposed package, the Senate and the Assembly packages. So I'll spend just a few minutes walking through some of the high-level major differences in dollar amounts. There are also some more sort of specific areas where each House took an action to direct some of the funding within a particular program to more specific activities. Happy to talk about that, but I'll focus on the high-level budget numbers for now. So if you look at your table on page 3, the first category of programs are the continuous appropriations. And just as a reminder, under current statute, 60% of revenue coming in from cap and trade auctions is automatically continuously allocated to these 4 programs. And in the table, the numbers are $1.2 billion for the continuously appropriated programs. I think a very important point to note on this issue is that those numbers are based on a revenue assumption of $2 billion in 16-17. And as I'll get to in just a couple of minutes, those revenue numbers are subject to a lot of uncertainty, and so we think that's an important consideration for you as you structure your package. Moving down the table, transportation-related programs. The biggest difference here is that the Senate did not approve the $500 million combined for transit intercity rail and the low-carbon road program proposed by the administration as part of its transportation funding package. The Assembly also approved the $100 million for the low-carbon road program, but moved that funding to the active transportation program instead. Moving down again for programs related to carbon sequestration, some minor differences between the 2 houses. The 2 biggest changes are the Senate approved only $25 million for the Healthy Forest program, and the governor and the Assembly both had $150 million for that program. However, the Senate increased the amount of funding for the green infrastructure program from $20 million to $100 million. Energy efficiency and renewable energy programs, the Senate added $30 million for the iBank energy financing program, and the Assembly reallocated $30 million from low-income energy efficiency and solar to the Enhanced Fleet Modernization Program Plus Up through ARB. Moving on to page 4 of your handout, some of the additional programs that are part of the spending packages, programs related to short-lived climate pollutants. The Senate reduced the amount of funding for these programs from $195 million proposed by the governor and adopted by the Assembly to just $50 million. One of the big changes, moving down the table again, is local climate programs. The governor proposed $100 million for Transformational Climate Communities program. The Assembly adopted the same dollar amount. The Senate increased that amount to $400 million. Water efficiency programs, Senate adopted a lower amount of funding, $50 million instead of the $90 million adopted by the Assembly and proposed by the governor. And finally, both houses adopted relatively small amounts of money for the Senate community outreach to disadvantaged communities, and the Assembly local government technical assistance and small business program. The overall amounts of funding in the packages, the governor and the Assembly, $3.1 billion. That again includes an estimate of $1.2 billion in continuous appropriations. The Senate package is roughly $400 million less than $2.7 billion. So if you turn to page 5 of your handout, we just wanted to provide some context on the amount of available funding and revenue uncertainty moving into the 16-17 year. I think the first point is that we're projecting that there'd be roughly $1.4 billion in unallocated funds at the end of 16-17. So this is money that has come in from auctions that have already occurred or that is expected to come in from the auctions that have already occurred after adjusting for the continuous appropriations and those programs that are receiving a piece of that funding. Now, the recent auction results, the May auction that occurred just a few weeks ago, adds a lot of uncertainty about the amount of money coming in 16-17. Just for context, the prior 5 auctions each generated over $500 million in state revenue. In contrast, the most recent auction generated only $10 million in state revenue. And there's, given the current market conditions, there's a lot of uncertainty about what level of revenue will be coming in 16-17. But it is possible that the next few auctions could have similar results to the most recent auction. And so we think that's important for you to keep in mind as you plan your funding package. Another related point to the revenue is that the funding for continuously appropriated programs could be affected by potential lower revenue scenarios. And given the revenue uncertainty, it's possible that these programs could receive significantly less than what's assumed in the budget packages. Finally, page 6 of your handout provides some of our recommendations as you sort of structure your 16-17 spending plan. And first, we recommend using the $1.4 billion in unallocated funds or available funds as your starting point for your expenditure plan, given the uncertainty about the future revenue that might be collected in 16-17. And ensure that the allocations that you make from that $1.4 billion, either in the current year or in future years, goes to your highest priority programs. And when thinking about your highest priority programs, consider both the continuously appropriated programs as well as the other sort of so-called discretionary programs, and ensure that the funding, there's an adequate amount of funding going to your highest priority programs. And finally, thinking about revenue that comes in 16-17, the legislature might want to identify how much any revenue that comes in it might want to use in future years, and for programs that it wants to fund in 16-17, what those highest priority programs are and how you want to structure a package such as funding buckets or continuous allocations to ensure that funding is going to your highest priority programs.
Great.
And happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Costa.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Amy Costa, Department of Finance. As the analyst noted, the administration is still in the process of reviewing the most recent auction revenues. We got those results relatively recently, so we are still reviewing those results to better understand what it will mean for expenditure plans. I'd note that the administration has long recognized the volatility of these revenue sources, which is why we've included reserve funds. I would note a couple of concerns in each respective House's plans. Within the Assembly plan, the administration is concerned with the proposal to redirect $100 million for the active transportation program, as well as trailer bill language identifying certain grade separation projects within the one-time $400 million funding for the transit and intercity rail program. Within the Senate plan, the administration's primary concerns are with the reduction of funding for forest health programs and the reduction of several water conservation programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember Oberholter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the LAO has an excellent point about the uncertainties regarding future funding and cap and trade, and it's going to put a lot of pressure because we have more competing proposals than we have funding for, even at the higher $3 billion allocation. So I think we're going to have to start coming up with some metrics to identify the priorities of which projects get funded and which don't and how much revenue goes to them. And I'm going to suggest that a metric that makes a lot of sense is the cost efficiency of the programs in terms of dollars spent per metric ton of carbon reduced, because that's the goal of the overall program, is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and I think it's a very natural metric. And just along those lines, pointing out that of all of the things on this list, healthy forests are one of the most cost-effective spends for cap and trade funding. So they're one of the cheapest ways of reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So it doesn't make much sense to me that that's what we're attacking first when we're talking about prioritizing.
Assemblymember Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Similar comments to my colleague, but some questions as well for the LAO. As you mentioned, the latest auction was significantly less in proceeds compared to previous auctions, $500 million down to $10 million. So in light of that, and in light of the fact that that's showing clear uncertainty in the market, the lawsuit still being alive, some uncertainty in the future, would it be the legislative analyst's suggestion that any monies allocated in the program no longer be continuously appropriated, but be appropriated as one-time funds until we have a better idea of where the market and how the market is proceeding?
I mean, I think given the revenue uncertainty, our suggestion is that to look at sort of the available funds, the funds that the legislature currently has available to it, and make sure that to the extent that there are high priority programs, that pot of money is used to ensure money is going to those highest priority programs. Regarding any revenue that comes in 16-17 and any programs that the legislature would like to try and fund in 16-17, it can look to sort of mechanisms such as buckets or something where, if the revenue comes in, then that money could be allocated to those programs. But we certainly think if there are high priority programs, even if it's continuously, some of the sort of continuously appropriated programs, then think about the available funds and using those to fund those programs, and then you can structure a package for any revenue that comes in above that.
Okay. And when it comes to highest priority programs, several of us in the legislature, a number of us actually, Republicans and Democrats alike, have signed on to letters suggesting that the programs be allocated toward projects that significantly improve air quality, that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, since that's what the program was initially supposed to be about. So would the legislative analyst agree that any funds appropriated, whether continuously appropriated or one-time allocated, should be geared toward programs that have a specific air quality or a reduction in greenhouse gas benefit that's measurable?
I mean, I think there's a couple of different issues. One is just the legal or sort of assumed legal requirements associated with the use of the funds and meeting sort of the requirement to ensure that the projects that are being funded do reduce greenhouse gas emissions. When it comes to sort of prioritizing the different programs that might meet that criteria, there are a lot of different factors, and each of these programs are intended to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also have other co-benefits, as you mentioned, local air quality benefits, which is somewhat different than greenhouse gas emissions. Mm-hmm. Other programs have other types of so-called co-benefits, whether it be water conservation, forest health, other types of things. And so ultimately, it's going to be sort of a balance between the greenhouse gas emission reductions that you're expecting to get from some of those different programs, as well as the legislature's priorities of those other types of benefits that it's interested in.
And does the legislative analyst agree that on the current project list anyway, that there are a number of items on the list, whether or not they're a priority to the legislature, that there are a number of projects and programs on the list that are not geared toward reducing greenhouse gases?
I mean, I think with a lot of the programs, there are sort of dual goals oftentimes with the programs. And I think the extent to which some of the different programs reduce greenhouse gas emissions is likely different between programs. And one of the challenges I think we're trying to wrestle with is trying to get good information on how effective those different programs are at achieving greenhouse gas emissions versus other goals. And so some of our comments and recommendations would be sort of to ensure that the level of information on the effectiveness of those different programs is of high quality and reliable for the legislature to make the types of decisions that it needs to make as far as its greenhouse gas goals, as well as its other priorities that it's trying to fund. Okay.
And then my final question is, does the legislative analyst believe that we're on shaky legal ground or shakier legal ground when it comes to the funding allocations for projects that are not related to a reduction in greenhouse gases?
I mean, it's a legal question, and there's a lot of uncertainty about sort of what the specific legal requirements for spending the money would be. I think our general take would be to the extent the programs are focused more on greenhouse gas emission reductions and the programs can demonstrate sort of higher greenhouse gas emission reductions, they're a little bit less legally risky as opposed to some of the other programs that might have more of a focus on other benefits.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may, just a couple comments. First on the Matt Holme, Department of Finance. On the question related to continuous appropriations, the administration is still supportive of the continuous appropriations. We recognize that the revenue uncertainty does create a lot of uncertainty for these projects, but if you then started budgeting what are in many respects a lot of transportation projects through one-time appropriations, that provides even more uncertainty for transportation projects. And one of the reasons why the continuous appropriations were established is to provide more certainty, long-term funding streams for these transportation projects. That's really critical to get these transportation projects going. And so we would recommend continuing the continuous appropriations. In regards to the question about the legality, the administration's proposal for cap and trade, all of the proposals meet the legal requirement that result in each program will result in additional emission reductions. And we believe all of those meet that legal test, and we don't think that there's any legal uncertainty about that at all. And we have a built-in reporting mechanism where every year the administration reports on the outcomes in terms of the tons of emissions reduced. So we think that there's a pretty strong legal belts and suspenders associated with the expenditure plan.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bloom.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the Department of Finance, I think most of my questions about the auction shortfall have been answered, but I'm wondering, I understand that the governor and the Department of Finance are reviewing. We're doing that too. Is there a timeline within which the department intends to come back with a revised proposal?
I don't know that we have a specific timeline. This is late breaking news. We did just get these auction results recently. I would caution against reading too much into one auction revenue result. To Ms. Olson's question about what this would mean for future revenues. And so we are continuing to analyze the data with the caveat that we don't want to read too much into one result.
And you also mentioned the prudence of, which I certainly agree with, of having developed the reserve fund. But by raising that issue, are you suggesting that one of the proposals that might be forthcoming is that we're going to dip into the reserve fund?
I think we're considering a lot of different options at this point.
Okay. That's
Thank
all,
you.
Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Senator Leno.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Brown, I think we're all scratching our heads, and I heard Ms. Costa say the same, that the administration is still analyzing the results and trying to decipher exactly what it means. But such a precipitous drop, it's almost unheard of. And I just wondered, from any other kind of auction marketplace that you might be familiar with, have you ever seen such a thing from month to month? And I'm not suggesting any conspiracy theories here, but help me, because there's some complexity to the whole cap and trade system itself and how the auction works. But I'm in an industry that is under the cap. I have a business. I've been over the cap, so I have to purchase credits to keep me under the cap as I'm doing my best through investments to reduce my CO2 emissions. But I'm not there yet, so I have to purchase these credits. So I've been in the marketplace. I've been at the auctions. I've been buying these credits through the auction quarter after quarter. Might I be sitting on some that might carry me for a couple quarters forward, or am I probably just purchasing for my immediate needs, or I'm probably also extrapolating where will my CO2 emissions be 6 or 12 months from now? How many credits am I going to need? So I'm also wondering, is there a possibility that somehow, because of the legal challenge, because of the 2020 deadline approaching, might there be businesses that are saying, I don't know that anyone's really watching, I'm going to go over the cap? What's our enforcement mechanism, and what thoughts do we have that maybe there's just less respect for the entire system given some of the uncontrollable factors that are out there?
So I think maybe the first point that I'll make is that sort of under the structure of the program, each individual company doesn't have its own cap. It's sort of an overall level of cap for all of the different companies that are part of the program. And so I think maybe sort of describing, I think, our understanding of some of the factors that might be sort of contributing to the behavior might help sort of shed some light on the current issue. And I think there are a lot of potential factors, and I don't know that we would claim to know all of them and all of the sort of behaviors of different market participants. But some of the things that we've heard are that, at least in the short term, the number of allowances, the overall number of allowances that are available that have been either given away or auctioned off so far might be more than is needed to cover the emissions in the short term. And so
that would be the suggestion that maybe this is a one-time occurrence and we're going to see a change up ahead.
Right, and maybe sort of at some point, if you have sort of more of these auctions where allowances don't sell, then the supply might tighten a little bit, and you might sort of get back to selling auctions and generating revenue.
Could it also suggest that the cap may not be at an appropriate level?
I mean, I think that's one important consideration, I think, is one of the fundamental drivers of the sort of market conditions right now might just be that the cap is not all that stringent, and that can be due to a variety of different factors. Could be economic conditions were different than what they were originally projected when the program was developed. It could be other policies that have been implemented to reduce emissions or having the effect of reducing emissions, and so the cap isn't having to do as much work as maybe it otherwise would be. And I think...
Which would also spell some indication of success of our goal.
Yeah, I mean, and that sort of gets to sort of the fundamental policy question of, from the legislature, if it has greenhouse gas goals, what tools it would like to use to encourage those greenhouse gas reduction goals. I mean, I think our view is cap and trade program and a market mechanism is likely one of the more cost-effective ways to do that, but there are other options that the legislature has adopted to do that as well. And so those are big policy questions. I think to your point about future using the allowances in the future, I think that might be one of the big factors that has changed in the market. There may have been sort of something that triggered various parties to not purchase the allowances now with the expectation that they can be used in the future, given the uncertainty around the future in the program, either the legal uncertainty associated with the current program or the extension of the program beyond 2020.
Right. And well, I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Senator Nielsen.
Well, I'd like to... one of the governing principles I think we have to be guided by, and the governor surely was when he submitted his budget in January, is caution. And hence he put $2 billion into the reserve for Prop 2. And we have to be mindful of that. This decline in the cap and trade auction is another caution signal. When I heard Finance suggest consideration of getting into the Prop 2 reserve, I don't know what you meant by that, getting into the cap and to the Prop 2 reserve. I hope that's not related to funding anything in this particular budget. Was that what you were suggesting?
Yeah, just as a point of clarification, the question was related to the fund balance in the cap and trade fund, the greenhouse gas reduction fund. The past 2 years, the administration, recognizing the revenue volatility of auction proceeds, has had a $500 million reserve proposed in the budget, kind of recognizing the uncertainty. And so the question, I think, was whether the administration would consider going into that particular special funds reserve, not the Prop 2 reserve.
Okay, I wanted to make sure there's a distinction, because I think we have to be very careful about coveting that Prop 2 reserve for various and sundry things. And certainly that's an issue the legislature needs to be mindful of. And there could be a lot of factors that do relate. Clearly, there are legal issues as well, and clouding what could happen here with the cap and trade are the pending litigation and legal opinions that question the executive authority to proceed beyond 2020. And there's good cause to believe there's a very dark legal cloud over the ability of the administration to proceed. So I think it's incumbent on the legislature as we build this budget to be very mindful of those vulnerabilities. The vulnerability legally, whether we can go ahead and build budgets and particularly make major obligations to the future and count on additional revenues coming in. So my point here is we better be very cautious. That should be our guiding principle. And certainly don't be looking at Prop 2 reserves for any ongoing spending.
Thank you. My question to the LAOs, when do you think you'll be revising your potential revenue projections for future auctions?
I mean, I think just given the uncertainty and sort of the drastic change in the markets, I don't know that we have sort of a plan to provide an updated revenue estimate right now. I think our main recommendation is just given that uncertainty that the legislature should begin by sort of planning on just using the funds that are available, and given the uncertainty about what's actually going to come in, use that as sort of the available funds to make budget allocations to highest priority programs. And if the legislature has an interest in allocating any revenue that might come in 16-17, then we can sort of help the legislature perhaps think through ways in which it might sort of, any revenue that does come in can be allocated to particular programs.
We're all surprised by the significant drop in the interest in the auction. Were there any market indicators as to what might have precipitated a 98% drop? I mean, this was not a 20, 30, or even a 50% drop. It's like the auction didn't even occur. It's a 98% drop in revenue.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the indicators to look at are the few months sort of leading up to the auction is that the prices for allowances on the secondary market, so trades that happened outside of the auctions, those prices dropped below the minimum price that the Air Resources Board sells the allowances for, and there were a significant amount of trades at that time. And so fundamentally, if there's a significant amount of allowances that are available out on the market for a price less than what they're selling for at the Air Resources Board, then it makes some sense that the auction was undersubscribed. I think there was always a lot of uncertainty about the degree to which there would be an undersubscription at the auction, and so that's, I think, where some of the surprises from the most recent auction come in.
Was there any reason to believe that this auction occurred at a time where there was a complete lack of interest? Because, again, when you have every other auction coming in at about $500 million and this one coming in at 10, it's almost as if there was no market for the certificates.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us it's hard to sort of say exactly how different market participants are thinking and behaving. I think one of the potential issues is just the uncertainty around the future of the program, the sort of legal uncertainty around the program now and the program beyond 2020. And there may have been sort of a shift where, as in the past, entities were purchasing up allowances with the expectation that they would be needed sometime in the future. But if there's uncertainty about the degree to which the program is going to be operated in the future and how stringent it's going to be, then there perhaps was sort of a shift in behavior in that way.
But there's nothing else in the market besides, well, you saw the early indicators of purchases of the allowances below the minimum price. Outside of that, there was no other indicators that you could see.
I mean, I think that was the biggest one, but we're continuing to try and sort of understand the market and what some of the various factors would be.
Going back to Ms. Costa, I know you mentioned that we're all still processing this information. Can you give a more specific timeline on when do you think you'll finish processing? I mean, is it going to be a few days, few weeks, few months?
Unfortunately, I don't have a more specific time frame to offer you, Mr. Chair, right now. As we've noted, it is recent data. It's one data point. So we would just caution against looking at the most recent revenues as signaling some future trends.
Given that, I think one of my concerns is that we're actually spending money that may never come in. So while I don't want to read too much into it, when you have a 98% drop, it's hard not to read something into it. And obviously, given the significant drop in revenue, how would you want to consider how we're allocating funding, or whether we're allocating funding that may not come in the future?
We're still reviewing it, Mr. Chair. I think, the results came in last week, so it is still relatively new information.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the committee? Okay, thank you. Moving on, we'll move on to issue 2, Aliso Canyon. I believe Mr. Martin was going to take the lead.